show that we'll be talking about is that there's a lot of a very circular, undulating movement around the stage with both dancers. And the words, with the exception of part about the Dalai Lama, are from Virginia Woolf herself.
From Mrs. Dalloway.
From Mrs. Dalloway, and we'll be weaving a lot of those words into our text, indicating when we can, when we're switching to that.
Just like that.
Somehow, seashore.
Two dancers. The Forsyth Company's Wolf Phrase, a piece created around Virginia Woolf's novel Mrs. Dalloway, generated by, quote, moving around the rhythm of Woolf's language, end quote. From its conception, the piece is about movement and language coming together and in relay. Its project, to make a movement phrase of the movement of her phraseology.
She comes from the left, at the back of the stage, dancing a circular movement, her gestures roll repetitive, a mewling of a seagull emanating from the movement, movement rolling, returning, ending where it begins, wrapping around vocalization.
He comes from the right, stands at the microphone and pauses, allowing her movement to settle into its never-ending re-beginning. And then he speaks, somehow, music. The space fills with an undulating sound wall, catching the mewling of the seagull in its rising. Somehow, he words, somehow, seashore. At word's end, a movement cuts him. He gestures to the left, in the direction of the mewling, musically enwrapped. Somehow, collectively beginning, collecting, falling, somehow suspended in midair. He gestures again, just like this. He falls, tumbling into the recesses of the rising sound space.
Somehow, music. Forsyth Company composer Tom Willems has created a sound surround. As Forsyth says, Willems gives performers an acoustic space to dance. The undulating of the music is the space of the movement. The piece takes place in this rhythmic space, more so than on the stage. The stage is just the launching pad. Everything that will be seen, heard, sounded, spoken, gestured, and evoked will collect in the rhythmic milieu hovering above, wrapping around. Everything will belong to it. Everything will collect in it, swaddled together in its undulations. For everything has a rhythm, and rhythms have a way of coming together. They resonate and accrue, twists and turns of phrase, inflections of movement and of language will assemble and accrete to compose this piece, just like that.
From the first moment, a space of mutual envelopment is set in place. It would be more precise to say that a milieu of mutual envelopment is activated. It is set, it takes, it is set alight. The set itself, the literal stage space and the things it holds, bodies, costumes, microphones, are but the kindling. The activation is between registers. It is set acoustically as well as linguistically, as speakingly, as movingly, as much in sound effect as in the vocalization of words, in gesture as in intonation. What is activated envelops the difference between these registers, as well as between the events occurring on each, folding into rhythm. Wolf phrase, waves collect, overbalance, and fall. He words.
At word's end, suspended by the rising sound surround in the midair of the dancer's rhythmic milieu, he falls. What is composed at this moment in the piece is the tension between rising and falling, language and gesture, their differential coming together. Just like that is not a comparison between the contrastive aspects. It is the difference staged directly sensed, just like this, feeling like at no other moment, like just this moment's felt intensity.
The piece will be made of these differentials, these tensions, these contrastive intensities of the moment on every register, as what happens on one also rhythmically accrues to the others. The composition will jump from gesture to wording and back again, forever circling, swaddling, feeling. Movement will cut into the wording, speaking will interrupt the moving. At times they will coincide, cut in, cut out, fold around and together, rising, falling, resonating, just like this, just like that, disjunct, rolling in difference together.
Wolf's in the the middle. What is of interest, Deleuze always maintained, is the milieu, what happens in the middle. It is not by chance that the greatest velocity is in the middle. The middle, between rising and falling, takes extreme speed, perhaps infinite speed, to pass between rising and falling. It takes extreme speed, at least at the velocity of thought, to pass between language and gesture.
What happens in the middle is that the either-or is held fast together in passing contrast. It is the holding together that is felt, in excess of one or the other. The in excess of the one or the other is not a both and. The either-or is taken as such into the passing. The differential is sustained. This is what Deleuze terms a disjunctive synthesis.
The middle, he says, is not an average, but an excess. It is through the middle that things grow. This was an idea of Virginia Woolf's, end quote. The middle is the extremity of disjunctive synthesis as a growth medium, the milieu of the performances accruing to itself. The pattern of the passings through the middle gives texture to the rhythmic space of the pieces occurring. Somehow, collectively beginning, collecting difference. Somehow, suspended in disjunctive synthesis.
The dancer's somehow is not the somehow of a practical procedure that is hidden or unapparent. It is transparent. Like when we say that a story is somehow sad. The sadness has been directly felt, just like that, no question. But all the same, there is more. The somehow evokes other sadnesses, unspecified. This feeling resonates with many another, not fully expressed in all transparency. It overfills itself with their difference, in the contrast of all sadness with happiness. Wolf phrase. And now, the same moment, supposedly without happiness. He takes her hand. The gesture passes between sadness and happiness at the speed of a supposition, at the velocity of thought. There is always an excess of the feeling in the feeling, by which it overflows or overfills its designation. In just like this, the this is too full to be designated just one. Wolf phrase. One separation. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. Disjunctive synthesis.
It's like this, just like sad, supposedly without happiness, like sad. Teenage speech patterns get it. Like does not designate an identity or resemblance. It marks an affective overflow in speech. This feeling is just sad. More than that, it is just like sad is. It refracts all sadness and its difference from happiness in the singular feeling this is. The words somehow and just like that mark the affective tonality of the moment. They mark the affect. They mark affect in language. They linguistically gesture to the feeling tone of the moment. Although marked in language, the feeling tone has risen from the middle in the passing between language and movement.
The any point of movement. Where does the movement start and stop? Forsyth. What manner of phrasing is native to movement in its disjunctively synthesizable difference from language and from other registers of experience? This is the core question around which the Forsyth Company organizes the choreographic process. It, quote, starts from any point and stops at any other.
This sounds like a non-answer of indifference. Whatever, to phrase it like a teenager again. But when it is added that, quote, any point within each piece contains the essence of the whole, it becomes apparent that far from, this is a quote from Dana Kasperson, one of the members of the company, it becomes apparent that far from being indifferent, any point is a most singular point. In movement alone, in its own order, uncontrasted with language, any point is already overfull. The overfullness of movement with itself on its own plane, Forsyth says, must be felt for movement to be made.
Once you stretch one limb, Forsyth remarks, all kinds of other places stretch and retract. Stretch it again in a different way, and the stretches and retractions shift. Every part of the body is a knot of different potential stretches and retractions radiating from that point as, quote, so many vectors. So many lines of movement potentially passing through each point. Each starting point of movement holds these potential passings through in itself, together in their difference from each other. The move is less a point than a vectorial gestural nexus, a differential dynamic knot of potential variations on itself, a milieu of movement potential.
The dancers are instructed to, quote, take the movement as far as it will go, end quote. But if you are attentive to where it is going, you feel it move in more than one direction. When the arm is stretching into a curve, the hip has already joined in throwing the curve. When the arm is finished moving, the hip is still going. Its movement radiates down into a flourish of the leg. A single movement comprises a differential, quote, spray, in the company's vocabulary, of movement lines akimbo, now beginning, now ending, in the moment, differently, together. The any point where a movement starts and stops is actually a spray, a splay, a spread, a point field. It doesn't start at any point. Movement is not simply localizable in space.
If the point field of movement is non-localizable, when a dancer seeks to generate a movement, it is not enough to get into position. Position is the gateway to movement, but it is not of its order. Position is of the fixed spatial order. Movement's order is of the always dynamically passing. A move, Forsyth reminds his dancers, is, quote, not so possessed of a place that you can't find another, end quote. Quote again, keep in touch with the motion, give up your position, end quote.
The question of dance is, quote, what is it about a position that made it a motion, Forsyth? Answer, the dynamic knot, the differential gestural nexus. Feel the spray, feel the nexus. From the movement, form the movement out of feeling. Keep in touch with the forming motion. Quote, chain the sensations rather than the positions, Forsyth.
The task of the dancer on performance night is to make visible what can only be felt. To make visible what can only be felt is not the same as performing a move. It is not to imitate or reproduce a movement form. Things happen, Forsyth says, but are not performed. You don't want to perform your work, he says. Do it without portraying.
Escape velocity. Chaining positions and postures is how we experience movement in its average, everyday functioning. We have our routines. The lunch bell sounds, a routine sequence of steps leads us largely unthinkingly to the cafeteria. Position after position, posture by posture, we proceed to the lunch line. We see a vending machine on the way. Unthinkingly, our hand delves into the pocket and feeds the machine. It's habitual.
Movement habits are sensory motor. There is a back and forth between sound and step, seeing and reaching, and chaining us forward through an established sequence. The element of sensory motor habit is sameness, the effacement of the diversity in difference. In habit, there is an elided recognition that triggers the sequence. The body thinks, implicitly, without really thinking. This sound means the situation is the same as it was yesterday. Therefore, my legs will carry me to lunch, as before. Recognition, repetition, same old sequence. Of course, a modicum of variation is introduced by chance of circumstance. The same old sequence is generally the same, day after day.
Habitually, the sensory motor is in the generality of the situation. The body moves into what today's situation has in common with yesterday's, and what it means for the stomach. Its habitual sequence of action is triggered by this general sameness and generally repeats itself in the same sensory motor unfolding. A sensory motor habit is a general idea of the body. It is a general idea thought implicitly. It is a kind of thought in action. But action is of a different order than movement as such, as in dance. The generality of the everyday situation predesignates the chaining of positions and postures as having standardized meanings. What defines action as a post-movement is that its execution is swaddled less immediately in rhythm than it is mediated by pre-established meaning. A meaning is always adaptive. This repeated sequence fits the general situation as before. A habit of action is a prefit. It works to standard. It is functional. It is performed. The prefit of habit is precisely why it can unfold unthinkingly, or with a minimal thinking implicit in action.
The general idea of these habitual sensory sensory motor sequences is what embodied cognition and enacted perception theory, or earlier Gestalt, have called body schema. Body schema are explained in terms of, quote, implicit knowledge. These theories typically appeal to the implicit knowledge of body schema to account for the thought-like aspect of action. Body schema are presented as the thinking of the body in the body. What is, quote, embodied are the schema. What is, quote, enacted is the general meaning of the adaptive situation. Maxine Sheets-Johnstone rightly observes that far from grasping the manner of thinking incumbent in bodily movement as such, the concept of body schema implicitly construes what occurs at the core of movement, moving on its own level, in its own register, as mental. Why else call it embodied cognition? What other conceivable status could the element of general meaning have but mental? The mental status of the body schema is confirmed by the fact that its sequencing can be adequately expressed in logical form. The sensory motor sequencing is an if-then. If the bell has rung, then it all follows.
Approaches relying on the concepts of body schema and implicit knowledge in this way fail in their attempted anti-Cartesianism. The body's dynamism is implicitly returned to a dependency on a core mentality that can be adequately expressed in logical form. The singularity of movements moving is unwittingly retrofitted into an implicit opposition between the mental and the physical mind and body. The only way to avoid this dichotomizing refit, the only way to restore movement to its gestural nexus, the only way to respect the dynamic spray of movement in and of itself, as well as in its splay between other planes of experience, is to say that movement embodies nothing but itself. Movement never embodies anything. It just bodies forth at any point. Embodiment is the wrong concept. Just bodying is better. Movement goes a-bodying.
Where the bodying is most immediately a thinking in movement is in movement extracted from action in the sensory motor sense. Subtract the action, Forsyth tells his dancers. Quote, we start out with a process and try to collapse it, end quote. Collapse movement back into itself. Subtract the general meaning from it. Undo it of its pre-established adaptations. Return it to its gestural nexus. Point field it. Don't chain positions. Chain sensations. Return the making of movement to the immediacy. Return the making of movement to the immediacy of its feeling. In that feeling, a different, more intense, utterly singular thinking will occur.
Where the body is most immediately thinking movement is not in the unfolding of body schema. It is in its folding back into itself, back into the dynamic nexus of its native gestural element, unfolding, infolding, inflection. A body is that which folds, Forsyth.
Movement's folding in on itself is not something the body does. It is what bodying is. Movement embodies only itself. Habit's adaptive action functionally unfolds. Dance movement inventively infolds. New moves come from movements contracting back into its any point, to resplay as never before, throwing new curves for the seeing. Of course, a newly minted dance move is practiced, repeated, perfected. It becomes a habit, an acquired skill. But at the heart of every habit, there is a contracting of the habit. Every adaptive unfolding comes from an inventive infolding. For this reason, there is a rhythm in dance creation. To avoid simply performing the movement sequences for the audience, to avoid simply displaying the visual form, and to avoid the dancers just portraying a character role in the performance or just portraying themselves in the role of performers, the bodying has to be reactivated at every moment. All of the techniques that Forsyth has developed over the years are techniques for movement reactivation.
With respect to all of these techniques, it helps, Forsyth says, to go, quote, extremely fast. Because at extreme speed, the body, quote, pushes the limit of its coordination. Take it to the extreme. Take the movement to its limit, quote, and then go further, Forsyth. Movement doesn't actually stop. It subsides into itself. It relaxes back into its field for the reoccurring. It collapses back into the non-locality of its any point, the unlocalized interval of no perceptible movement. Wolf prints. Waves collect, overbalance, and fall.
In every movement's rise and fall, at any point, there is an imperceptible interval where the rising and falling coincide. The form of movement in and of itself is not a straight line. It is a pulse. It is a waveform. Foresight. Waves on the seashore, one coming in as the last is going out, overtaking, receding. Don't be where you are. Make yourself tidal. In the tidal interval, the waves cancel each other out for an uncountable beat. They collapse into each other in dynamic superposition. At this any point of superposition, there is no visible movement. The body, movement, is in suspense. But the interval is no less emotional for being in suspense. A welling, already a next overtaking, a receding. A one, a two, the interval is co-motional. It doesn't stand for anything. It doesn't mean anything in particular, particularly not in general. It stands for what it is, which is what it does. A repotentializing interval of movement folding its sequential forms into its rolling on, the subsiding trace of the last embodying with the next to come. Movement never stops. It suspends itself in its own furtherance.
Movement moving.
Movement only comes from movement. Spinoza. Movement is sui generis, all and only in and of its own order, its own nexus. Language is likewise sui generis. Words only come from other words in recurring waves, rising and falling from the linguistic anypoint of the superposition of sound and speech, and of silence and noise.
Language cannot fully describe movement. Movement does not give itself over to the order of language. The orders of experience are incommensurable. There is always a residue, a holding itself in reserve, each in its own element. At the extreme, each suspends itself in its own reserve potential, in the trace of a last, foretracing many a next in a zone of indistinction. Each order is self-tracing. In the middle, they splay together in their difference. Modally incommensurable, they only relate outside anything in common, most especially outside the logical common of anything that can be attributed core mental status.
There is no need to surreptitiously appeal to a common realm of implicitly mental status in order to account for the thought-like aspect of movement. Movement, quote, feels like potential. Potential is abstract by nature, in the sense of not yet being this or that, here or there. What is abstract feeling, if not thought? Movement moving is thinking feeling, sensation integrally imbued with singular notional force. Potential is not of the if-then. Potential is allied to the what-if. The thinking feeling that is movement moving is speculative, notional in the sense in which these two words can be used as synonyms.
Language and movement meet in the thinking feeling. In thinking feeling, both are notional in analogous fashion, that is, at the imminent limit of their own most any point, wholly and only in their own mode. Each is a thinking feeling after its own fashion. It is here at the extreme point of the incommensurability that they resonate. It's like they mimic each other. They notion to each other at a distance, in their difference from each other. Each any point as imminent limit twists around into the middle. In the middle, the imminent limits are an abstract superposition. It's a 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, in many a multiple. Thinking feeling is a transversality of all planes of experience in the imminent twist. It is like life of the moment.
The motional relational. In what manner is movement induced into furthering itself in the invention of new dynamic forms? The answer is quite simple. Movement only comes from movement. But movement does not come from movement only sequentially, in a rolling continuity of thinking, feeling, motionally, bodying. Movement is always triggered relationally. That is the answer. Movement only comes from movement relationally. Even one body alone is dancing relationally. Its movement stands out in its difference against the background of all the other dance movements it potentially might have been.
Movement is not sensory motor. It is emotional relational.
Going extremely fast, as Forsyth suggests, is a key technique for making movement move. When a body folds in on its own gestures faster than the general speed limit of sensory motor coordination, it self-generates an inflection of its line of movement. It activates to the extreme and throws itself a curve across the regenerative interval of its return to the any point. You have to go so fast as to, quote, be ahead of yourself, end quote. Don't be adaptive, be predictive. That is, be speculative. Feel it coming at the speed of thought.
Emotional relational is in the speculative mode of the what if. What if the bodying folds now extremely fast, too fast for any subject to think it? What if 1, 2, 5 bodies do this at once? What if? The what if is moving, thinking itself out in an uncommon intensity of feeling.
What if?
Forsyth asks, can ballet actually produce something we don't know? We'd like to investigate what it feels like to speak that way, end quote. What if this épaulement, this singular movement formation, were turned in on itself, subverting the organization of the organs, the limbs? What if the gaze, normally turned askance toward the audience, were turned back into the head in visual, quote, disfocus, so that, quote, the body becomes an ear, an organ for listening, Forsyth, to the rhythmic milieu? What if this extension we call an arabesque opened less onto a posture or a pose, a completed movement form, than onto the feeling of a passing balance?
Forsyth's work builds on the what if. It is never a question of formally working something out in advance. Speaking of his collaboration with composer Tom Willems, he explains, he, Tom Willems, always wants to know what we are thinking, and I say nothing. We're just organizing bodies. We, quote, are not thinking. The thinking is in the moving.
Organizing bodies does not mean placing bodies on the stage and planning them into forms. It means reorganizing the body itself in its commotion, its commotion with other bodies. It means activating a collective rhythm on the level of a relational movement, a level on which form does not single out. Quote, when I go into the studio, I want to be able to see what is in front of me. I want to not have another idea, end quote. Forsyth. Idea here is allied to form. What if asks another kind of question, a question of technique. The biggest challenge, Forsyth said, is not seeing what I want to see, but seeing what's actually in front of my eyes, a spray.
The focus in Forsyth's work on the what if is everywhere present in his ample arsenal of movement techniques, but can be felt particularly keenly in the techniques of cueing and aligning. In moving to cue, Forsyth asks the dancers to become sensitive, collectively, to how the dance as a whole moves. You cue to the trace of a movement moving, to its repeatable tendency, yes, but even more so to the what if of its emergent evolution. This means that you dance less into the movement form, as it happened in the past, than into the speculative figuring of movement's incipient future. Aligning, then, means turning to the what if as it commotionally appears in movement transition. You move to the trace of a movement coming to a landing. You align to its capacity for transition, to its complex of potential already on its way. You align to the what if of a movement's futurity, the not quite of its having come into being. If then necessarily follows, gravity acts on the body in movement, moving it to land or flow in relatively habitual ways. But movement moving has been opened up by the what if to its own variations, to new collective sprays, new combinations, new flow matches, as the company calls them.
Quote, syncing is not what's important in the sense of matching already known timing, Forsyth explains. What's important to the what if of cueing and aligning is how position itself becomes movement. Quote, go slower, be in the other's past, right before they catch up to you, then move past them to their future, look for the moment, aim at it, rather than going directly to it, then shift, time shift. You don't always move at extreme speed, you vary the rhythm. Remember the rhythmic milieu. What if is the actually seeing what's in front of you of movement's capacity to speculate.
Well phrased. As if things were just this bright, or as if things were just that loud, or twisting at the hips, this fast, gesturing toward her that far, as if there was just this one distance, this one marking a short distance between his hands, separation. One separation, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, tapping the mic. 1, 2, 1, 2.
What if the one were always already more than one?
What does it feel like to speak that way?
Becoming visionary.
He taps the mic. 1, 2, 1, 2. We sense a shift in register. He is preparing to tell us something, preparing to give us an image in a register of direct address we will never see here again throughout the piece. She continues to move slowly in the distance, movement mewling. And then he speaks, walking back while holding the microphone as though opening the acoustic environment to its furthest recesses, recesses that include her without in any way addressing her role, her place in the story. He speaks directly to us. Did you hear that one about Virginia Woolf and the Dalai Lama? Pause. Well, Virginia Woolf and the Dalai Lama are walking down the beach, and there's something shining in the sand, and the Dalai Lama, he bends down, and picks it up. It's a mirror, a little mirror, a pocket mirror, and he looks into the mirror and he says, "Hey, I know this person." And Virginia Woolf says, "Give me that mirror." And so she looks into the mirror and she says, "Well, of course you know this person, silly. That's me. That's you, 100 years from now. 100 years from now."
When Forsyth speaks of not wanting to miss seeing what's actually in front of my eyes, it seems that he's referring to vision in a standard sense. Look in the mirror, see what's there right in front of you. He wants to see what is happening and choreograph with the present in the mode of the just like that. No ideas in advance, let the process show you its own evolution. Don't be afraid to let things reveal themselves, Forsyth tells his dancers. Sometimes it, what the work's about, doesn't come until the end, end quote. The problem is the movement is aligning to futurity, its reflection as scans. 100 years from now. That's me, silly. How can he or the dancers work with what's actually in front of my eyes when it's landing onto the present from the unknowability of the future? How can they work with the mirror when the mirror at once reflects me and you? 1, 2, 1, 2. In the uncertain field of vision that includes the now and the 100 years from now. What does it mean to really see in the mode of the speculative?
Movement generation techniques in the Forsyth Company are enlivened by the paradox of double vision. To be in the present in its unfolding is to be in the future flow of a nonlinear time match. The sensory motor is always in commotion with the motional relational, in disjunctive synthesis. The body, articulating in the present the complexity of dance form, is always also being asked to match flow to a welling future movement. The sensory motor is alive in the taking form of movement, led by the motional relational, poised at the limit, where now and next are co-composing.
Dana Kasperson explains, quote, "I experience two kinds of vision at once. The space around is alive with potential, invisible forms and lines of movement. I am continually ambushed, caught up in this welter of double vision," end quote. This superposition of actively engaging with the just now, just like that, of the complexity of the present presenting itself, is superposed with the futurity of how the what will come has already left its trace on the movement welling.
Forsyth describes this technique as, quote, having a vision. Having a vision in the moving means moving beyond this body, this form, toward the unfolding of how movement will be affected by the force of the middling which will flow into it from its future. From the future, a dizzying task, but one that cleaves movement from its habitual sensory motor cues and alignments, inviting it to invent a bodying. Two versions of cueing and aligning are co-active here, in the field of double vision. There is the habitual sensory motor organization of the body in its causal flow, a forward step cueing to gravity, aligning to the slope on the floor, and the Forsyth Company's technique of cueing to movement moving in a non-local field of action and collective aligning in counterpoint to the field's pattern interplay.
Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway also plays with vision, tuning it toward the visionary. It was this aspect of the text that most excited the Forsyth Company in the creation of Wolf Praise. Working through the text, Forsyth speaks of having the insight that a technique could be invented to make dancing visionary. the dancers could technically become visionary. The technique that he originally developed, and that was enhanced through the making of the piece, quote, had to do with identically remembering another person's variation or sprays and building a kind of architecture of movement around it, end quote. Caveat, quote, you had to keep seeing this person dancing in order to perform it. So it was a way of having a collective, you had to keep seeing this other person dancing in order to perform it. So it was a way of having a vision, end quote, a collective vision.
The sensory motor organization of the body in its sequential form following is subverted by the force of the visionary. To generate a movement, the dancer must move beyond the form of the what was and learn how to, quote, sense motion traces. This opens up movement to its otherness, similarly to the way Proust talks about the necessity to open language to, quote, a kind of foreign language within language, which is neither another language nor a rediscovered patois, but a becoming other of language, a minoritization of this major language, a delirium that carries it off, a witch's line that escapes the dominant system, end quote.
Double vision, in the end, is less about vision than it is about proprioception. To visualize a movement is to see it proprioceptively in body vision. To move into the futurity of movement moving is to have a body vision in the dancing. It is to move with the future in its unfolding. It is to be moving in the very creation of space-times of experience. To be caught up, just like that, in the simultaneity of the weight of movement perishing as it meets the welling of its futurity, dancing at the nexus of experience, enfolding.
Dance that thought around.
As if. What must language do to become visionary? What are language's techniques for opening? What are its techniques? What are the techniques for opening language to the foreignness, as Proust says, of its becoming other? In Virginia Woolf, the as if plays this role, folding as it does the present into its double. Woolf, from Mrs. Dalloway. She began to go slowly upstairs with a hand on the banisters, as if she had left a party, where now this friend, and now that, had flashed back her face, her voice, end quote. As if the holding pattern of a difference in time looped onto itself toward the impossibility of getting the story straight once and for all. Not just it could have been this way, but it was this way and that way as well at the same time. Disjunctive synthesis, just like that, as if, straight in the middle.
Wolf phrase. As if, he says, as if things were just this bright, or as if things were just that loud, this fast, that far, as if there was just this one distance, this separation. As if, Virginia Woolf writes, as if this beauty, this scent, this color, were a wave which she let flow over her and surmount that hatred, that monster, surmount it all. 75 times, as if in Mrs. Dalloway, each time touching on the impossibility of a simple coupling of this and now. As if a rhythmic suspension that holds the presenting of the present to itself in itself, that denies this image of its simplicity of unfolding, creating a knot in the discursivity of language. As if a mode that moves language to its narrative limit, pushing language to say not how if and then follow, but how if becomes its own limit, a transversal limit that cuts across the if-then.
When the Forsyth Company decided to work with Mrs. Dalloway, the focus, once again, was not on retelling her story, but on, quote, moving around the rhythm of Woolf's language, Forsyth. How to move into the text's visionary force, how to fold movement into the as-if of Mrs. Dalloway's speculative language, how to create techniques that are capable not of responding to language or illustrating language, but of moving in counterpoint with language, dog-like, seagull-like, not in the realm of representation, but in the elemental realm of formative feeling tone. Quote, Richard and I work to dehumanize our bodies. This is one of the dancers speaking Poulenc. Richard and I work to dehumanize our bodies by giving them elemental qualities like the ocean, or animal qualities like a bird, a dog, or bees. Movement thus becomes entangled with sound or nature, circling and mewling, barking and sounds of waves surging, end quote. Circling, jumping, surging, not forms, but activation contours.
Forsyth defines counterpoint as, quote, a field of action in which the intermittent and irregular coincidence of attributes between organizational elements produces an ordered interplay. Counterpoint of movement and language in Wolf phrase is best understood as a coinciding of both at their limit, in the relational anypoint of the motional and the notional. Here, the what-if of movement and the as-if of language co-compose. Together, they unsettle the linearity of time in the tense of the if-then. In the speaking and in the moving, working in disjunctive synthesis, two speculative time signatures interrupt one another. What if asks the dancer to, quote, anticipate the other dancer's future. In this movement proposition, the dancer is being asked to shift time, make time in the tense of the future felt. As if asks the reader to place in an uneasy holding pattern more than this one image, more than this one narrative line.
The coinciding of the as-if and the what-if produces what Walter Benjamin might call, quote, a flash of similarity, end quote, just like this. Similarity at the flash point is non-sensuous. Non-sensuous because it is felt at the any point limit of expression where both movement and language become foreign to the general functioning together, in, quote, a delirium that carries them off, a witch's line that escapes the dominant system, end quote. Non-sensuous similarity, directly thought-felt in the register of the visionary.
Wolf phrase, an ordered interplay that invents relationally at the limit of the notional and emotional.
When the notional meets the emotional, it's not that we no longer understand the words. It's not even that we don't ally the words to the movement. It's that the words in the mode of the as-if contort to the movement they activate. It's that language, when in counterpoint with movement at the limit, tweaks into rhythm with movement. At this any point, language, like movement, proposes itself as an organ for listening. We hear it sounding, its counterpoint with movement, creating a joint rhythmic milieu. While we can differentiate the words from Willem's acoustic environment, while we know what is language and what is movement and what is sound, we are no longer certain where expression begins and ends. Notionally, we have no idea. Knowing and unknowing co-compose, dancing, thought around.
And so we are left not with a story about a dog, he wags his leg, or about a sparrow, her movement mules, or about a woman and the Dalai Lama seeing each other cross-eyed, but with a dance that moves language, with language in the middle, just like that.
Reset. Midway through the piece, a shift occurs. The movement is cut by touch. Touch taking on the role of the all of a sudden, resetting the movement in the making.
The touch cues the return of the same moment, with a difference, Wolf phrase, and now the same moment, supposedly without happiness, as if he takes her hand. Still no happiness.
Stricken once.
He pulls her back, away from the microphone, away from language, his movement folding into hers, the gesture of touch leading her into the vortex of a commotion increasingly turned in on itself, their movement swarming, future forming.
She moves back to the microphone, his body still connected to hers, his balance passing through an arabesque. She,
stricken twice.
an arabesque spiraling already into a circling, his body folding through her backward movement, she reaching toward him, hands held, a sense of push and pull, a suspended connection, wary of the measure of the touch, it seems. For while the movement looks to proceed by cause and effect, in fact, what is active is the mobile relational interval, a co-constitutive suspension of movement in the moving. Touch strikes, it cuts into the relational interval. It does not stop movement so much as it sets it in motion again, differently. It reorganizes, reorients, pulling movement moving into knife-edge precision. A moment of clarity, stricken.
The moment of clarity appears from the wash of movement moving. The clarity was, of course, already there, active in the midst, if eclipsed, by the velocity, the agility of the movement moving. Clarity is a signal to the viewer. Look again, it says. Think, feel the difference. Don't forget, the touch comes between the moving and the speaking. recalibrating not only the motional, but also the notional. Think touch as that which acts on the flow, to pull from it a clearing of relation.
Touch resets relational movement not by bringing it to rest in this or that human body, but by activating a momentary pause in the frenzy that reorients the field as a whole. Yes, he lays his hands on her shoulder. Yes, she's still. But really what is happening is less about him or about her or about them touching. It is about giving us a window into the wider field, giving us pause to encounter with them the counterpoint of movement and language in a field of experience continuously folding back on itself. No linear sequencing here. Touch as the reset button for re-beginning, a spiraling back.
Wolf phrase. Okay, we're back.
The touching reset of the relational movement creates a hiatus in movement moving. This invites us to see dance moving not in form but into the sprays, the traces, through which form spreads. Sprays, the affective surplus of a sensory motor, the curve that exceeds this habitual stance, the moving at the point of inflection that tunes toward a collective individuation not only of the dancers, but of the whole field of activation, the field which includes at its limit the folds of Mrs. Dalloway, as well as every movement proposition that went into each of the choreographed sequences. Everything is there in abeyance, suspended in each movement, lingering in each utterance. But what makes the work is not the everything, but the overflowing singularity of how at this point of inflection tunes to this rhythmic fold at any point, and the counterpoint of the notional, emotional, stricken, reset, from lingering to just like that.
Wolf phrase. Stricken thrice. Pa. Suddenly amplified sound wall fills the moment. Pa. Silence. Same moment again without the song.
We start with the process and try to collapse it.
The any point beckons. We watch. The movement dizzying in its speed. No, start again. Watch again. Be in it. In the middle. Touch. Stricken. Any point in space resets to the any point of movement. Learn to feel it. It feels like potential.
Wolf phrase. Same moment, all of a sudden, again, somehow, ha.
Somehow circling. Wolf phrase. All of a sudden, you remember where you are. Pause. Goodbye.
Okay, we're back.
Wolf phrase's visionary quality creates a suspension, a lingering in the future-forming moment. She, movement muling. He, again sitting toward the edge, watching her, waiting. This holding pattern, cut by touch, reset, pa, circles the piece on itself, somehow. Two velocities are continuously at work, two modes in attention, two levels, language and movement, in counterpoint. This doubling keeps the piece active, alive at the limit of what movement and language, in their differential, are capable of. One register alone, if given dominance, would dampen the force of what is at work here. We might look for meaning instead of heeding to movement moving. We might catch ourselves seeing Mrs. Dalloway told in movement, illustration, representation, redux. But this is not what is happening. A thirdness is coming into play in the elemental force of the two, 1, 2, coming together. This thirdness contracted, always, through the creative disjunction of the match flow and its reset.
What do language and movement do at this limit where they refract into thirdness? They remake themselves at the edge of time, where time itself is at the limit of its spiraling. Time folds, wolf phrase, in ever widening circles, life and death into a composition in the shape of a wave cresting, stricken, leaden, circles.
Wolf phrase. Fear no more, says the heart. Willem's sound acute, the movement frenzy, she at the microphone. Fear no more. He on the ground, moving around her, the intense sound crescendoing in a semblance of the pop, resetting the field of movement and language. She, still standing at the mic, her breath sounding, in, out, the effort of her words, of her movement, palpable. He, crouched, watching her from a distance. She, fear no more, says the heart, breath, in, out, committing its burden to some sea, in, out, and with a final twist, she bowed her head, very politely, in, out, she went, barely audible, a quiet darkening, she had gone, she, the face in the mirror. That's me. That's you. 100 years from now, death folding into life, life folding forward. She had gone. She, voice of no age, no sex, elemental, here and gone, of the wave, overtaking and receding, just like that, somehow.
Across the co-composition of just like that and somehow, across the threshold of death and its lingerings at the edges of life, the refrain returns, as if there were just this one. As if two could make one. But what if two made three? What if the two, the 1-2 of language and movement were reset just this way into an inexpressible thirdness? What if just like that and somehow were the cues through which the piece aligned itself again and again to the force of its doubling? What if just like that and somehow were the terms of the work's limit, the mark of how the work must continuously move through the absolute difference of a vertiginous, lingering in expression?
Somehow, a likeness. Somehow, as if 2 times, 2 events, this and its likeness, could linger in cohabitation, as if, just like that. The flashpoint of just like that, the flashpoint of non-sensuous similarity, the cut into likeness that brings time's overflow into the moment, this moment. But what a strange moment, this specious present. A moment qualified not by its being present, but by its spread, by the span of time it includes, the past and future rolling into it. A visionary moment, a futurity in the making.
This is what language and movement can do in co-composition. They can take the lingering of the somehow and, with touch, reset it towards the just like that, such that suddenly the shifting, the contorting of time is acutely felt across expression in the making. Co-composition, suspended in the force of a recurrence.
The piece comes to an end. He at the microphone. She standing back, movement muling.
Full phrase. And as they looked, the whole world became perfectly silent. Pause. And a flock of seagulls crossed the sky, first one gull leading, then another. Pause. And in this silence, in this purity, in this pallor, bells struck 11 times, their sound floating up among the gulls.
13 seconds of silence. He standing at the microphone, looking forward, but gesturing back in her direction. She behind him, completely still. No more mewling. The acoustic environment full, once more, with villain's sound. The scene is set.
Full phrase. And then, all of a sudden, the stage bathes in a darkness that lingers across the all of a sudden.
All of a sudden, a lingering. And so we are reminded that the suspension is everywhere speciously present, speculatively active at different velocities, notionally in different registers, relationally across every modality of experience. A lingering, a suspension of isolatable movement form, a suspension in language as designation or narration, and also a suspension within movement moving of its human characters, tuning to their elemental qualities, gesturing to dance's capacity to hold dissonant times together.